Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome to my video for the launch of the September Thinking of You Challenge. I'm using the City Stack set by Concord and Ninth. I'm using two of the landscape stamps here. I'm going to use the hill and trees first. I'm using my Creative Corner in the Misty since I'm hanging off both sides. And I'm going to ink this up with some VersaFine Black Onyx ink. This is Canson XL Mixed Media paper. When I do watercoloring, I like to clear emboss so that it helps me stay in the line. So I'm going to do that. And now I'm going to stamp the city in the background. It doesn't exactly line up. And of course, I'm going to be stamping over the tree, so I'll have to fix that. I started off using some Simon Says Stamp Fog ink. And so what I'm doing is I'm inking up the stamp, and then I'm just sort of eyeballing where the trees are, and I'm removing the ink with my absorber on all three of these trees. Because I'm going to be coloring these trees with a pretty dark color, if I end up not getting enough of the ink off, it's not going to be a big deal because this is a really light color. All right, I stamped it down, and then when I looked at it, I realized I could barely see it, and I wanted it definitely to be a little bit darker. So I thought maybe I will try it again with the fog ink. So I inked it up, and here I am removing the area under the trees, and still it wasn't dark enough. So I moved on to pumice stone, which is what I used the first time I created this card. But when you put water on it, it kind of fades the outline a little bit, so I was trying to avoid that. But I really wanted it to be darker. So I'm stamping this, and you can see I did a pretty good job of stamping, although I removed some of the bottom part of the city. I'm going to go back in a second and replace that. All right, so I inked up on the right side to finish off the cityscape. And now I replaced it in the original position for that first stamp. And now I'm going to put the pumice stone on and then take it off the top since my top is already stamped. And then I'm going to remove again behind the trees. I'm really aiming to get some of that city image that I didn't get the first time at the bottom. And so I was pretty happy with the way that turned out. I'm using distress markers for all of my green areas. Forest moss, peeled paint, mowed lawn, and twisted citron, which is actually more of a yellowy color. I'm going to color direct to paper with my markers. I'm starting with the forest moss. I'm going to do the left edge and the bottom, which is the darkest shadow area. Then I'm going to come in with the peeled paint and go all the way around, and then mowed lawn, and then finally the twisted citron. I'm going to take a brush which has a very thin tip, and then I'm just going to add some water to it and tap all around. And I'm really just trying to get water all over the entire tree, and the water will pretty much do all the work for you. Now I am doing a little bit of tapping from dark area to light area, and that's because I want it to look a little dotted, like it's got leaves on this tree. And I'm actually going to do a few layers here. So I'm going to let that dry and move on to the second one. As I'm coloring this, I'm noticing that the colors actually blend really well direct to paper. So you could actually eliminate the step with the water and just leave it with just the blended markers. It still looks pretty good. But I'm going to go ahead and continue on with this water. You can see on the left, my first tree is starting to dry, and it's already lightened up quite a bit. So I'm just going to, while I've got some green on my brush, I'm going to go back in there and tap it and move that water around a little bit. And then get some more of the dark into the lighter areas. And then I'm going to let these two dry again and work on my third tree, working the colors from the outside toward the inside, and then again taking my water and tapping it in. Now as I'm doing this, you can see now, looking to the left again, that because I didn't really add too much more color, that it dried on those first two trees and got even lighter. So I'm going to get my forest moss and use some more color on the trees to darken them up a little bit. So I'm just going to put some on my craft mat, pick it up with my brush, and tap it in. One of the things about watercolor that's kind of frustrating for me is I get it perfectly the way I want it while it's wet, and then as it dries, it completely changes, and then I feel like I have to do it all over again. So you'll see that I'm going back in over these trees quite a number of times to get them exactly the way I want. Now you can see right here I'm adding some dark area to the right because some of my building behind it is showing through. I'm going to color this grassy hill with the same order of colors. So I'm going to start at the top with the forest moss, move down a little bit with the peeled paint, and I'm overlapping the colors a little bit. And you can see with this mowed lawn, I'm also dotting a little bit above to kind of combine that brighter green with the more muted greens. When I first go over this with water, I'm really just blending the dark colors together because I want the bottom of this cardstock to stay pretty light. So I'll get all the dark blended, and then I'll clean off my brush and pull down some of that Twisted Citron with just a little bit of water so that it fades to white. My sentiment is going to go in the lower right-hand corner, so I want to make sure I leave the area pretty white for that. Once I'm done blending this downward, I can go back in and add a little bit more of a dark area between the dark colors and my Twisted Citron. So you can see I'm going to pull a little bit of that dark color just a little bit down to make it look a little more textured and blended. And then of course the trees dried a little bit more, so I felt compelled to go back in there and do a little bit of extra coloring. I'm using again the forest moss and adding a little bit more color where I felt like it had faded a little bit too much. And I'm going to do that on all three. And you can see there's definitely some lighter areas, too much light on this third tree here. All right, after this, I'm going to leave it alone and work on the buildings in the background. I have pumice stone and weathered wood. The weathered wood is kind of a grayish blue color, and I'm going to combine that with the pumice stone, which is the color I stamped in, to add a little bit more of interesting shadow on these buildings. I'm not really being too precise with this. I'm just getting some water on my brush, picking up some pumice stone and coloring in my building. And then I'm going to grab just a little bit of the weathered wood and add it to the shadow areas. So kind of at the top where that round part of the building is, and on the left side of the building, and then wherever there's a building in front of another building, I'll add a little bit of extra gray to the building in the back. So you can see it really starts to come together. Now I'm also going to make sure that I go all the way to that grassy hill and keep my color pretty light as I get to the hill. I colored outside the line, so I just wanted to show you how I clean up the watercolor. This is a clean brush, so I'm just applying some water. You can see it basically disappears with water, and then I just dab it with a tissue to clean it up. And that is the great thing about these distress inks, is that they are very soluble with water. I'm doing a quick coloring of my tree trunks with gathered twigs and walnut stain. I actually was using the wrong marker there, but I did walnut stain on the left side and then the gathered twigs on the right side. And then I just took my brush and tapped some water in here just to blend them together and make it have that same look that the top of the trees have. Of course, I cannot leave well enough alone, so I'm going back into those trees. You know, it's funny, the first version of this card I made, I maybe went back and did those trees one extra time. And this time I'm doing it 3 or 4 extra times. So it's just different every single time. Because this building stamp doesn't line up exactly with the hill, I'm going to take a pretty dry brush. So I'm not adding very much water, and I'm actually drawing the edge of the buildings back into the picture here so that they extend all the way down to the hill. And then I'm blending it out with a little bit of the pumice stone and the weathered wood, just like I did at the top. I felt that the top of my card was a little bit too stark white, so I'm taking some tumbled glass, I'm putting some on my craft mat, and you can see I'm using very, very little at the very top of this card. So I added water first so that I wouldn't get any harsh lines. You could barely even notice it, but there's definitely some blue up there. The heart in my wreath turnabout was just the perfect size to stamp in the upper left-hand portion of where my buildings are. I'm going to stamp it in Stampin' Up! Real Red. I'm using my sentiment from the Artful Flower set by Simon Says Stamp. I actually trimmed my cardstock so that I had 1/16 of an inch matte on all sides before I stamped this in VersaFine Black Onyx. Now I'm going to flip this over and use some Tombow Mono Multi-Glue, and I'm just going to cover the whole back, getting as close to the edge as I can without having it seep out when I press it down onto my cardstock. Now this is a folded Hero Arts black note card, which is black on the outside and white on the inside. I'm just going to put a block over it till it dries, just a few minutes, and that is the card for today. Using glue and a thin watercolor paper really helps to eliminate the warping that you get from the watercolor. I know I kind of made that card into a long, drawn out watercolor process, but I guess that's just the way it works out sometimes. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.